The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It is wall time. Donald Trump says the construction of the Mexican border wall will begin immediately. He signed an executive order regarding immigration. Here is Lion Sean, as I'm calling him, Donald Trump's press secretary, Sean Spicer. Take a look at the big announcement.
The first order is the border security and immigration enforcement improvements. It addresses long overdue border security issues, and it's the first order in that will be to build a large physical barrier on the southern border. Building this barrier is more than just a campaign promise. Sure. It's a common sense first step to really securing our porous border.
If anything, it's not common sense, but I'll get to that a little bit later. Of course, no details provided about the length of the wall or the cost of the wall, not at all surprising. Now remember, Mexico will pay for the wall, right? Well, no. The new plan is that U.S. taxpayers will be paying for the wall, and then somehow Trump's going to negotiate with Mexico that they will pay for the wall. How? He doesn't provide the details. What we do know is that the Mexican president, Nieto, says he is not going to pay for the wall. Mexico will not pay for the wall. We know that Donald Trump tweeted this morning about the upcoming meeting with Donald Trump, that if they're not going to pay for it, if Mexico is not going to pay for the wall, then we might as well cancel that meeting. And it is really not looking like Mexico is going to pay for the wall. Trump also planning to cancel catch and release. He wants those caught at the border to be detained at taxpayer expense. And you know who makes a ton of money by detaining undocumented immigrants until they're deported? Big banks that invest in prisons with contracts to detain people for pre-deportation holding. No surprise about the plutocracy there. Trump also signed another order to take federal grant money away from so-called sanctuary cities. Totally ludicrous, totally authoritarian. Many mayors have already said, yeah, we're just not going to do it. And then reminder, the wall makes no sense, right? We actually don't need the wall nor more anti-immigration measures. The wall won't stop people, as I've told you, because of tunnels and ladders for physical crossings. But more importantly, a ton of undocumented immigration is from people overstaying visas or people flying in and then just not leaving the country. And also, and this is the amazing thing that nobody seems to get on the right, Pat, we're at a net loss with regard to undocumented immigration from Mexico. Number one, undocumented immigration from Mexico continues to decline. It's at a 40-year low. And there are bigger outflows to Mexico than inflows from Mexico. Over the last 40 years, this is when we've least needed to do anything additional.
Well, I mean, regardless of whether it makes sense or whether it'll be effective, I mean, Donald Trump has promised to build this wall from day one. He won in part by reaching out to the more nationalistic and racist factions of the Republican Party.
Sure.
So regardless of whether or not it's going to be effective and how costly it's going to be, of course he's going to go through with it.
Right, because he's going to get things done. Again, here's a graph. As I mentioned, there's never been a time in the last 40 years where spending money on a wall was less necessary. Here is U.S. apprehensions of undocumented immigrants by nationality. The idea that immigrants commit tons of crime is wrong. We know that border cities with large amounts of undocumented Mexican immigrants like San Diego and El Paso have some of the lowest crime rates in the country. Generally speaking, there's no link at all between immigration and unemployment of native-born workers. Undocumented immigrants have a big positive effect on the economy is the reality. Most of the money that undocumented immigrants make is spent in the U.S. Some goes back to their native countries, but most doesn't. And number two, undocumented immigrants are paying into programs that they'll never use, which will be really important as baby boomers continue to retire. This doesn't defend law breaking, but this is to make the point that not only is the wall not a solution, it is also the least necessary thing that we've seen in decades with regard to immigration. What will the Trumpists do if Trump builds the wall or a partial wall or some fencing and says he did it and made America great again, yet jobs continue to disappear? Who will they blame? I don't really know the answer to that. The guy who isn't going to be the autocrat in Washington, President Donald Trump, wants to, number one, bring back illegal torture techniques, and number two, bring them back by executive order, the mechanism that he was slamming President Obama for using to get things done. This is yet another one of Donald Trump's new executive orders. This one is called Detention and Interrogation of Enemy Combatants. It would lift bans on CIA oversee black site prisons used for torture. President Obama shut those down. They were hugely damaging to the image of the United States abroad. The executive order would lift other restrictions in terms of how detainees can be treated. It would reverse President Obama's directive to give the Red Cross access to detainees to see how they're being treated and what their health status is. It would expand the use of GITMO, which should have been shut down years ago. We've got an interview coming up today for you about that. And the order doesn't address the legal conflicts. Trump can say, bring back enhanced interrogation or whatever, but there are obvious legal conflicts here. John McCain does address them, more on that later. The legal conflicts being that these techniques are against the law, and trying to revert to the Bush-Cheney era of, quote, fighting fire with fire, as Donald Trump has been saying. This is stooping to their level. And the backstory, if you've forgotten or just were not paying attention at the time, is that the Senate voted to ban torture overwhelmingly in 2015. So they did this on the basis that torture violates both U.S. law and international law, the Geneva Convention. We've got the new Secretary of Defense, Mattis, who I have no shortage of criticisms about, but he even says, no, we don't want torture. It doesn't work. Just shouldn't be using it. Trump, on the other hand, Pat, feels that torture works. He was asked in that ABC interview yesterday, he feels that it works.
Yeah, and it seems as if General Mattis had, for a bit of time, convinced Donald Trump against the uses of waterboarding. But I think the point here is that regardless of whether or not it actually does work, Donald Trump's going to go through with it anyway because he thinks that these people deserve it.
Yeah, that's a common thing. We've talked about this sort of strict father morality on the right, which is you can show the right that their policy doesn't actually help to achieve the goals they claim to want. And it often won't really change their minds because on some level, they believe that the policy reflects what people deserve. And many Republicans think that some of these enemy combatants deserve to be tortured. New CIA director Mike Pompeo seems to be cooperative, says he'd consider using torture. Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, said we can't base national security policies on what we see on television. It has to be grounded in reality. And every day, Trump is bringing us to a new low in a new way, probably worse than Cheney on this issue. And yesterday, we had the story about how, yeah, we can blame and judge Trump voters for their votes. Here is another way in which whatever the reason you ultimately voted for Trump, whatever that reason was, this is the end result. This is what we're seeing. And John McCain is not taking any of it. Republican Arizona Senator John McCain sent out a tweet about this exact issue yesterday, where he said, POTUS can sign whatever executive orders he likes, but the law is the law. We're not bringing back torture. And you know things have shifted radically when the guy I never would have voted for in the 2008 election for president is the voice of reason within his own party. Some people saying, should we start talking about impeachment if this goes far enough, especially the torture issue and legal implications? That's an uphill battle. That is a really uphill battle, especially because you need Congress to be involved in those impeachment proceedings. A House and Senate, again, controlled by Republicans, which is the party of the president in the White House. That's a real uphill battle, really bringing us back to some pretty dark times in recent American foreign policy history. Every day, it's amazing how much destruction Donald Trump is leaving in his wake. Hey, here's something I want to briefly touch on. Yesterday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed above 20,000 for the first time ever. And if you looked at right-wing media, you would have thought that this not only represented some incredible economic achievement, but also that Donald Trump was the savior that led to such a major economic achievement. If you looked at Drudge Report or Fox News, just everywhere, praise for Trump. Donald Trump's own son, Eric Trump, actually tweeting about Dow 20K, saying, amazing, and he is just getting started, hashtag Dow 20K. I hate to slow the roll of some of these Trumpists for a second here, but let's break this down and figure out what's going on. Number one, yes, yesterday the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed up 253 points from when Donald Trump took over as president on January 20th. That represents a gain of 1.28% in 4 trading days. That's about a third of a percentage point per trading day. I want to remind you that under President Obama, the Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 139%, meaning that it more than doubled. Where were the conservatives when President Obama oversaw one of the greatest stock market rallies in a very, very long time? Oh, I can tell you where they were, Pat. They were either saying that Obama had nothing to do with it, or saying that the Dow Jones Industrial Average isn't reflective of the strength of the economy. And both are partially true, but the same logic is not being applied to Donald Trump. 20,000 is an arbitrary number, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average is price weighted versus market cap weighted. So to give a very crude example of this, if you buy one banana at the grocery store for $1 and you buy, 100 ice cream cones at $10 each, the average price between ice cream cones and the banana is going to be exactly halfway, 50, between $1 and $100. But that doesn't mean that you had half of your spending go towards the bananas and half of the spending go towards the ice cream cones. Maybe a little bit of a crude example, but the point is 20K doesn't tell us anything per se. I, as people know, basically invest in index funds. So I am sensitive to the changing prices, values of indices like the NASDAQ and Dow Jones and S&P 500, et cetera. But what I want to remind you is that my response now is the same as it has been under other presidents. Stocks tend to do better under Democratic presidents. The stock market is not the be-all, end-all for assessing the economy, but it is one metric that we have and will continue to look at. The hypocrisy, though, is what's stunning here. And it gives us big insight into the mind of a Trumpist because they celebrate a 1% gain under Trump. Do they praise Obama for more than doubling the stock market? I don't hear it.
Yeah, I think you've hit on all the major points there. It was interesting because after Donald Trump won the election, there was speculation that the stock market would drop.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case, but we know just from history that the market does better under Democratic presidents.
Sure.
So if I was to predict, I would guess that the market at some point would start to go down again?
Yeah, you're predicting the stock market, something that many people try to do, and we can legitimately wonder how good anybody can be at predicting the movement of the stock market over a very long period of time. But remember, the ownership in the stock market is highly concentrated in the U.S., particularly among the wealthier. What I think we need to agree on is that we have many indicators that alone aren't the indicator of economic strength. And many of these indicators are somewhat related to the policy of the president. And all taken together, they can paint a broader picture for us of how the economy is doing. Maybe that's too nuanced and boring for some Trumpists, though. They'd rather ignore 139% gains under Obama and cheerlead 1% gains under Trump like he's the second coming of Jesus or something else, for lack of a better term. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Christine Coutinho. I'll remind you, this is your show. It really is viewer and listener supported media. And if you value what we're doing, please become a member at davidpakman.com/membership. And if the normal prices strike you as high, by all means, use the coupon code IVoted17 for a discount. If you ever shop on Amazon, stop by davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop, and it'll send us a little kickback from everything you buy. It doesn't cost you one extra penny, so really appreciate everybody doing that. The Reddit discussion forum that we run is now home to around 2,300 of our viewers and listeners there. It is growing and growing. Another record month already. Days before the end of the month is even here. Really great discussion going on. We've brought on a couple of moderators to ensure that blatant trolling and personal attacks aren't out of control. They're doing an excellent job. Let's take a look at some of the popular discussions from the last week on Reddit. A very detailed response to my story about concerns over identity politics being prevalent at the Women's March, and a really thoughtful response generating a lot of discussion. Another thread from Reddit. I know exactly what Donald said to Melania, a user, I guess, hypothesizing about what Donald Trump said to Melania Trump in that now viral clip that we played earlier this week. Also from our Reddit discussion forum, a viewer who had their faith in my commitment to ethical and responsible journalism shaken by my interview of alt-right white nationalist leader Richard Spencer. We'll deal with that more a little bit later in the show. Also from Reddit, Spencer is crazy as hell. People coming away with the perception that Richard Spencer is out of his mind as a result of the interview. And also from our Reddit discussion forum, Trump's press secretary Sean Spicer has an odd, long-running feud with Dippin' Dots. I did not know about this until I saw it on our Reddit discussion forum, and that is indeed true. And lastly, from our Reddit discussion forum, thanks to Trump, scientists are planning to run for office. A very, very interesting article from The Atlantic, which I encourage you to check out. So join, participate, suggest stories, suggest guests to be interviewed, and you can subscribe, of course, at davidpakman.com/Reddit. Costs nothing. Join the community. Be a part of it. Okay, there's been huge blowback from some to my interview with alt-right leader, white nationalist Richard Spencer. And every time I do an interview with a controversial figure with deplorable views, there will be critiques that I am giving someone a platform that doesn't deserve a platform. That if I'm having someone on at all, I am effectively promoting their views. There's a fair criticism or debate to be had about whether general, broader interests are better served by exploring where these horrible views come from versus pretending they don't exist and sort of no platforming them. My view, and you know this if you've been watching the show for a while, is that I am of the belief that we should actually find out where extremism comes from and figure out what are the sources, what are the bases for these beliefs. Now, when I do these interviews, if you're familiar with the show, you know that I don't yell and scream and tell the person that they're a horrible person. I don't know what that would achieve. What I seek to do in being cordial is try to figure out what is the basis for the beliefs of these individuals. And I think, Pat, people who are familiar with the show tend to know that that's the strategy, whether it's the God Hates Fags people, Glenn Miller, the Quran burner, whoever.
I also just disagree with the fact that you're giving them a platform. If you enabled him to speak for maybe half an hour unchallenged, I could see that being giving him a platform, but you're challenging him the whole way.
Yeah, and again, challenging. Some people could fairly say, David, you didn't challenge him loudly enough because you weren't screaming at every single thing he said. You know, if I do that, we won't even really have an interview. It will not really be a conversation where we could learn anything. Unfortunately, a few progressive, liberal media people really didn't like the fact that I did this interview. One of them was liberal radio host Nicole Sandler, who I know personally, haven't seen her for a while, but know personally. She tweeted, she said a number of things, but it started with, D. Pacman, you seriously interviewed Richard Spencer? Why would you give him the time of day? And it sort of escalated from there. She ended up unfollowing me on Twitter and saying that I was just doing absolutely the wrong thing and that it crossed a line. It triggered a really big back and forth with a bunch of people on Twitter sort of debating. She went on to say, I don't understand giving people like that more room to spread vile hatred. They don't deserve a mic. Go get those ratings. By the way, I've interviewed many people with whom I disagree. Don't misstate my stance. I just won't promote hate mongers or Nazis. It's clickbait. Shame on you. I hope your alt-right listeners love it. I was saddened that this was what Nicole felt about the interview. Then Abby Martin, formerly of RT, currently of the Empire Files. Again, someone I know personally. She sent out a tweet last night. There were a number of tweets, but it started with at D. Pacman, my Twitter handle. It's so great you're giving Nazis a platform and treating their ideology as just differing political views. Totally what we need right now. Triggered another significant back and forth that lasted many, many hours. Again, my view is you can't really debate such insane ideas. The point is, let's figure out where it comes from and expose that this is a non-insignificant part, in the case of alt-right beliefs, this is a not insignificant part of Donald Trump being president of the United States. Where do we draw the line if the policy is You don't interview people whose views are really vile. What about a guest that's anti-gay? I find that deplorable. What about someone who says gay people are going to hell, or people who don't care about poverty? That's hugely deplorable. It seems very arbitrary to me to come up with some sort of list of whose views are too vile to ever be given the opportunity to appear on a program. Do you only interview people you agree with? What about far left people who I might share ideological perspectives in terms of policy issues, but who believe that violence is justifiable for political gain, versus me who would prefer not to see violence for political gain? That I think that we're opening up a sort of dangerous door with that policy. Viceland did some ride-alongs. I don't know if it's neo-Nazis or KKK or whatever. They went to cross burnings or some insanity. Does that cause or normalize cross burnings and neo-Nazism? I don't think so. During those pieces, you don't have a host yelling and saying, you're a terrible person the entire time. I think the exposition really speaks for itself. I also talked about some viewers. Again, I think mostly the viewers who are longer time viewers of the show and get the interviews get that this is not a new thing. This isn't new to the show. We did the Glenn Miller interview years ago. We interviewed Terry Jones, the Quran burner, people from Westboro Baptist Church. We've interviewed many extremists, and I have learned a lot about how does someone like this exist in the world and sort of generate their worldview. Last thing I want to touch on, the idea of normalizing. The normalizing thing relies entirely on the idea that the audience is going to be tricked into all of a sudden thinking white nationalism is a really good thing based on some guy having a conversation about it on my show, making pretty horrible arguments, I would add. I don't think that the audience, Pat, is going to all of a sudden say, wow, the white nationalist was allowed to speak. I'm super convinced by him. I think maybe I should look at white nationalism as a
No,
worldview.
of course, our audience isn't going to blindly go along. I mean, I think there could be a line there, but I think the line gets drawn where someone's advocating for violence or making threats against people. It's not just voicing their opinion.
I even think that that's a difficult line, because someone could see the interview with Spencer and say, listen, David, he wasn't advocating for physical violence, but the suggestion that races should live separately and there should be a peaceful ethnic separation, that it's ideologically and politically violent. I wouldn't disagree with that. I wouldn't disagree with that, which is why I think even that line, Pat, it's an interesting idea. I think even that's hard to draw.
I guess so, but I mean, Richard Spencer wouldn't even elaborate on how that would be done, how the races would be separated.
Yeah. Keep sending me your thoughts on this. I think it's a debate that I would be lying if I said I wasn't up later than I planned to be last night as a result of this. I mean, really, I think that this is not a good direction for critiques of journalism to go. I guess fundamentally, that's sort of my gut feeling about it. I was referred to as a comedian and featured alongside John Oliver and Stephen Colbert in a video by the International Business Times. Yesterday, this tweet was called to my attention, where the International Business Times tweeted out, comedians such as John Oliver, David Pakman, Stephen Colbert, and Mike Rugnetta have made net neutrality matter. I found the story on the International Business Times website. It's a story about the incoming right-wing FCC chair, Ajit Pai. It's a good story about Trump's FCC chairman pick. And then there's this video where, I want to be super clear, I'm thrilled to be featured next to John Oliver and Stephen Colbert. I admit I hadn't heard of Mike Rugnetta. Thrilled to be featured alongside them. It's interesting, I guess, to say that I'm a comedian like they are, but the clip they selected is sort of funny. Let's take a look at a little bit of this video.
A federal court ruled that high-speed internet service can be defined as a utility. Yes, the internet is officially a utility, just like heat or plumbing, which explains why you do so much of your web browsing on the toilet.
Now, Donald Trump's addressing of net neutrality was to say, quote, Obama's attack on the internet is another top-down power grab. Well, keeping the internet freer is a power grab from Obama. That doesn't really make sense. And then Trump went on to add, net neutrality is the fairness doctrine and will target conservative media. I can't even understand what Donald Trump thinks net neutrality is in order to explain to you why he's wrong. But what I can tell is that what Donald Trump is saying makes absolutely no sense. Flattered to have been featured, Pat, and also glad somebody paid attention to the issue of net neutrality, which I think is not getting enough attention paid to it.
I mean, I certainly wouldn't call you a comedian, but sometimes the topics that we cover on this show are just so hilarious, especially in the era of Trump, that I could see how you'd be perceived as someone who does comedy.
Maybe my stunned disbelief at what's going on comes off as if I'm doing satire in some ways. I can kind of see that. All right, we'll take a break. Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Andrew Turner, who's a disabled veteran and activist for veterans' rights. He's a former Guantanamo Bay prison guard, an advocate for access to plant-based health options, and for closing Guantanamo Bay. Andrew, there's so much to talk about with you, so I'll just jump right in. How long were you a guard at GITMO?
Right around 9 months.
Okay. And when you went there, what was your sort of general belief about what it was like there, what was going on, what your experience would be like?
So I initially had volunteered to go in 2009. The Navy had a program called the Individual Augmentee Program, where they would come along and say, hey, we need this group of people for these deployments. This option came up to go to Guantanamo. This was after the president had signed the executive order to close it. So the understanding was we would be going to be part of the task force that would be there to close it. And I felt that that was I wanted to be part of that versus being there keeping it open, obviously.
So you were already going in with the opinion that it should be closed down.
Yes, sir.
And why did you feel that way?
You know, initially they set up Guantanamo maybe with some form of good intentions. I don't really know. I don't totally understand or even want to try to explain what those intentions may have been initially to keep people safer, I guess is what always the argument has been about keeping it open. But I've always kind of viewed it when we passed the first year or two and we weren't focused on due process for detainees, and standing up for the rights that we as Americans always seem to hold dear. I started to have kind of an issue with what was going on there. At the time, I was already obviously active duty in the military, so it's much tougher to do things like protest and other things when it directly reflects some type of government action.
And what impact did being there have on your mental state, on your mental health?
I never knew. Had I known now what impact that would have had, I probably would have thought twice about going down there. Obviously, I tried to go down there with good intentions. I have quite a bit of empathy for people that are detained indefinitely. I don't agree with the actions our government's taken, and maybe that partially affected me. But then also while I was there, I early on I was violently assaulted by a particularly angry detainee that was trying to injure himself. And while we were trying to keep him from doing that, he started smashing his head into the floor, wound up doing some pretty bad damage to my right hand to the point where I no longer have what would be considered a fully functional hand. And that definitely affected me. But I think, also just the amount of time working there definitely changed things for me. And about a year later, after I returned, I wound up being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and a generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah. What does the average person, even people who follow what's at least published about what goes on at Guantanamo Bay, what does the average person not realize about the day-to-day of what's going on there?
Well, I think there's a big assumption that, every guard that goes down there is somehow complicit in, what many would consider the evils of our country, when the reality is many went down there either voluntarily by, taking one of these individual augmentee sets of orders, or going down there with some type of a unit, and many of them were of the ideal that, the three words fair, firm, and impartial meant something, and still to this day do. And so there's always there's this right or left thinking about it, when the reality is it isn't black and white. Neither the military presence there nor, even the lives of the detainees. It's just not black and white, and it's not easily explained for the average person to where they would understand what's going on there.
I read the Reddit Ask Me Anything that you did recently, sort of in
Sure.
preparation for our interview, and I noticed that there were a number of questions asked that you sort of said you couldn't really talk about the answers there. Now, to clarify,
Right.
is that because the answers would reveal classified information, or because you signed a non-disclosure agreement, which is sort of a very different reason for not being able to discuss something?
Both.
Both.
I mean, it's obviously some of the work was classified. I was actually attached to Task Force Platinum, which I can't talk about, partly due to its classification, but also because of the non-disclosure agreement that I signed. And so anything that touches on operational, anything that touches on specific detainees, anything that that we've been briefed that we can't talk about, I can't talk about, and I don't know when that will ever change.
Yeah. Do you think that that is part of the reason why there isn't more of a proactive uprising about closing Gitmo? Because a lot of what goes on there just never really gets to people here in the United States?
No, I think the far bigger problem is we've allowed the political narrative to become fear over if it closes, and we focused on due process, and we looked at moving detainees that we plan to try and detain long term, through punishments that our courts decide on. I think that we've allowed the political message to be permeated by fear of things like Islamophobia, and this concept that somehow they're going to not escape while they're at Guantanamo, but somehow if we brought them here to America, or to the U.S. and tried them in courts and then detained them somewhere, or at that point, if they were found guilty, imprisoned them in somewhere like the Supermax in Colorado, or our, the maximum security prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, that somehow they would escape and be loose, or somehow they'd be allowed to be loose. And that's, that's the farthest thing from the truth.
Yeah, I mean, that argument sort of implies that we can't really trust the most secure prisons in the U.S. to keep people inside, right? If the argument is even if they're on American soil, in the most secure of all prisons, those prisons just aren't good enough, is what the argument sort of implies, isn't it?
Well, that and that our U.S. court system, our federal court system here in America, is somehow subpar compared to the military tribunals that have failed to even try 20 detainees in 15 years.
I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned PTSD, generalized anxiety, as a result of this incident where you were attacked by a detainee at Gitmo. When I introduced you, I mentioned you're also an advocate for plant-based health options. And one of those that many people may not have heard of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, is kratom. How is it pronounced correctly?
You'll generally hear it either kratom or kratom.
Okay. Talk to us about
other
what that is
but
and the controversy surrounding it right now.
Sure. So kratom is a leaf off a tree, generally grown in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, Borneo, imported here into the U.S. Up until this past year, for the most part, the FDA and DEA played kind of hands off, and then the FDA came in and did kind of an import alert early in 2015, and they started having the Marshals and Customs seize shipments from, from vendors, and it was already kind of difficult for the vendors because then they had to, just the way the whole FDA dietary ingredient rules changed in 1994 with the Deschet Act. It's always been kind of tough to sell this and market it because you had to market it as not for human consumption, and it's just this weird limbo that it was placed in. Well, then in September 1st, the DEA came out and put in a proposal of intention to make it a Schedule 1 substance.
Right.
At that point, a Schedule 1 substance pretty much cuts off any kind of research. And there was some really promising research already going on. So nobody really understood why, without any kind of input between the FDA, DEA, and the research community and the consumer community, where this came from, because it didn't make a lot of sense. They've since retracted that, opened up for public comments. They received record number of public comments about this. I just did an interview for my own podcast a couple days ago, and there's a social worker and her team that are actually working on breaking down all the public comments, and they've even found that it's over 99% support keeping it legal.
And for people who don't know, Andrew, I mean, we're talking about something that, if I understand correctly, in small doses, the effects are caffeine-like, and in larger doses, sure. Is it fair to say similar to opiates?
I wouldn't say opiates per se, but it does. There's 27 alkaloids, 27 plus alkaloids in the plant itself as the way, consumers would get it. And a couple of those alkaloids would be opioid-like, not opioid. There's a little bit of a difference, and that's due to how it interacts with the opioid receptors in the body. But even the researchers have said that you couldn't really call it an opioid, and definitely not an opiate, because that would mean it would be coming from the opium plant, and it doesn't. The tree's a little more related to the coffee plant than it is anything else. But it does. It does have some analgesic effects. It does interact with the opioid receptors, so a lot of people use it for pain management. There's some that take it, and it's become really effective for a lot of people getting off very hard opiate substances, and even things like Suboxone and methadone that for a long time was the only way to get off like a heroin addiction. But then they in turn created you into a methadone or a Suboxone addict, and they even had far worse withdrawal symptoms. So this gave a lot of people a chance at kind of a new life. And so when this proposal to schedule it came out, it crushed a lot of people. It was very scary to think that the government would take away something that was helping so many.
Well, it seems to me like a total pharmaceutical industrial complex attack, right? I mean, when you talk about something that all of a sudden is going to Schedule 1, something that wasn't even on the radar of so many people for so long, at a time when we're learning more and more about its uses, it seems like a money grab from me. And the key thing is, as you mentioned, it seems to be effective in weaning people off of opiates. And for many companies, that means losing money, doesn't it?
And I think that's part of it. I think that's, there's also been a couple of trade groups from the supplement industry that for a while now have tried to get kratom's legal clarification removed and it completely taken off the market, maybe partly because they have to go through such stringent laws that they wanted everybody to, but instead of saying, hey, why isn't there better regulation of this, they wanted it banned too. And then you come to find out that some of these companies also represent Bayer, BASF, DuPont, right, and these large chemical companies, not just pharmaceutical, but also chemical companies that make quote unquote supplements.
Sure. Well, listen, we're going to be following both what goes on with kratom and what goes on at Guantanamo Bay. I really want to thank you for sharing your story today. We have been speaking with Andrew Turner, who's a disabled veteran, activist for veterans' rights. and also a former Guantanamo Bay prison guard. Really appreciate you talking to us today.
Hey, David, can I share one last thing?
Please.
There's a petition to the White House going on right now. If anyone is interested in signing it to keep kratom legal, we're still working on those petitions to the White House. This one you can find at the American Kratom Association's website. Just Google American Kratom Association. There's more information about the petition to the White House currently. We're just trying to keep it legal and accessible for anyone that wants to have that access.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've gotten our first look into the first few days of the Trump administration's day-to-day, and it is really, really bad. The Trump administration is in disarray. Donald Trump is reportedly demoralized because he knows millions of people are questioning the legitimacy of his presidency. Apparently, he's constantly just watching TV and super focused on tweeting instant responses in many cases to stuff he sees on TV instead of doing presidential stuff. It's like there's a little kid in the White House. Here is a quote from a Washington Post article about this from a couple of days ago. Many critics thought Spicer, referring to Sean Spicer, went too far and compromised his integrity. But in Trump's mind, Spicer's attack on the news media was not forceful enough. The president was also bothered that the spokesman read, at times haltingly, from a printed statement. So Trump not happy with Sean Spicer's public apologia for completely debunked lies from Donald Trump. Also from the Washington Post article, Trump has been resentful, even furious at what he views as the media's failure to reflect the magnitude of his achievements. And he feels demoralized that the public's perception of his presidency so far does not necessarily align with his own sense of accomplishment. Then there's a Salon expose about Trump's reported fixation or addiction to watching TV. Mike Allen and Jim Vanderhei of Axios said that, listen, Trump doesn't read books and he avoids reports that are really long, that he considers to be too long. He doesn't use computers. He rarely uses a phone for anything but calls. Even those infamous tweets from Trump are usually dictated to someone and submitted by others. But the TV watching aspect is starting to concern some aides. Here's a quote from the Axios story. Most mornings, Trump flicks on the TV and watches Morning Joe, often for long periods of time, sometimes interrupted with texts to the hosts or panelists. After the 6 a.m. hour of Joe, he's often on to Fox and Friends by 7 a.m. with a little CNN before or after. He also catches the Sunday shows, especially Meet the Press. The shows, as he calls them, often provoke his tweets. The day of our interview with him, all of his tweet topics were discussed during the first 2 hours of Morning Joe. This is having an impact, a negative one. And on Saturday, when Trump saw that TV networks were talking about his tepid inauguration turnout compared to President Obama's impressive inauguration turnout in 2009, he became so furious. And I guess his staff, Pat, were trying to tell him to just ignore stuff and not start tweeting. And they could not convince him not to tweet. And that's when Trump started tweeting about it.
And it's just so concerning that he's watching TV around the clock. I mean, I get it. The guy's a narcissist and he's getting a lot of validation because they're covering him all the time.
Yeah.
But when you combine narcissism with just being lazy, I mean, that's a dangerous combination.
Well, everything we suspected about Trump in terms of his lack of intellectual curiosity, never reading, narcissism, etc., everything we saw before Election Day is now coming true and being verified day after day in the early days of his presidency. He's insecure. He's thin-skinned. He's concerned with optics rather than governance. He's not knowledgeable. He can't focus on anything when it comes to reading. You basically have a posse of low-information grifters running the country, which is exactly what we expected. This is the first week. Can you imagine the insanity that will take place and the damage that will be done in the 4 years to come? Okay, I want to give a sort of, I guess it's a shout out, a kudos to some Democrats and one Republican in one case who had the balls to vote against some of Donald Trump's cabinet picks. The Senate has now voted on 4 of Trump's major appointment nominees and has confirmed all 4. On Inauguration Day, retired Marine Corps General James Mattis was confirmed 98-1 as Secretary of Defense. The same day, you saw another Marine Corps general, John F. Kelly confirmed 88-11 as Secretary of Homeland Security. Monday, U.S. Representative from Kansas and Tea Partier Mike Pompeo was confirmed by about a 2-1 vote, 66-32 as Director of the CIA. And on Tuesday, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley was confirmed 96-4 as UN Ambassador. Hearings are still going on. There are way more roll call votes set to happen, including the ones for Jeff Sessions and Rex Tillerson, Ben Carson, Betsy DeVos. But let's take a look at the voting that has taken place so far and look at which Democratic senators have done the right thing by voting no on Trump's picks and which Democrats have fallen in line with the nominees. Democrats who voted yes on all 4 nominees. Here's the list: Chuck Schumer, Tim Kaine, Feinstein, Schatz, Donnelly, Klobuchar, McCaskill, Shaheen, Hassan, Heitkamp, Reid, Whitehouse, Warner, and Joe Manchin from West Virginia. The only senator to vote against James Mattis was New York's junior senator, Democrat Kirsten Gillibrand, and I commend her for it. There's also, there's such a long list of incidents involving James Mattis and why he has no place being there. The silver lining is he is against torture and has said that to Donald Trump, but lots of crazy stuff in Mattis's background. For John F. Kelly, 11 senators voted against his appointment, all Democrats, and they made the right move. Kelly oversaw Guantanamo. He fought to keep it open. He advocated for force-feeding inmates there. He did a whole bunch of stuff that's absolutely horrible. And those who voted against his confirmation included Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Jeff Merkley from Oregon. Then we had U.S. Representative Mike Pompeo's confirmation, which had the most resistance, 32 no votes. Even a Republican voted no there. Rand Paul, seemingly not liking some of what Mike Pompeo said there. Rand Paul, the one Republican of all of the nominations so far to make a no vote.
I mean, it's kind of tricky because you want to obstruct at the right times. So I don't know if I was a senator, which people I would vote for and which I wouldn't. But certainly the people like the Rick Perrys, the Ben Carsons, the Betsy DeVosses, who are just ideologically opposed to the positions they're going to take over.
Yeah.
There's no chance I would vote for them.
There are some Democrats who voted no on 3 of 4 Trump cabinet picks, and I will show you who they are. Number 1, Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. She voted no to Mattis, Kelly, and Pompeo. Then we have Martin Heinrich. Martin Heinrich voted no on Kelly, Pompeo, and Nikki Haley. And then we have Tom Udall, who voted no on Kelly, Pompeo, and Haley, voting yes on James Mattis. They're doing something. Liberals have been pressing Democrats to block some of these nominees. Little effect, sad, low energy, but at least these Democrats have done something to try to prevent the insanity. Real quick, Donald Trump, as you know, if you watched yesterday's show, listened to yesterday's show, he announced that he is going to be demanding an investigation into voter fraud, including people registered to vote in 2 states. This is a voter fraud investigation that's totally unnecessary. It will use taxpayer money for something that's been widely debunked. It turns out, though, you can't write this stuff, that President Trump's own daughter, Tiffany Trump, is registered to vote in both Pennsylvania and New York. Heat Street has learned. As a reminder, remember this tweet from Donald Trump, where he said, "I will be asking for a major investigation into voter fraud, including those registered to vote in 2 states. Tiffany Trump lived in Philadelphia while attending UPenn, graduating in May, and also registered in New York." Now, the reality is this is not a big deal. As long as you don't vote in both places that you're registered, it's not a big deal. So this is not so much about the hypocrisy of Trump, but rather that it's just not a big deal. And even his daughter did something which does not break any law. If you try to vote in both places, that's a different story, though.
I mean, I'm much more interested in the hypocrisy of Trump. It reminds me of when it came out that Melania Trump did those modeling jobs in the United States when she wasn't authorized to work here. But
illegally
of
working.
Course, that's okay if you're a Slovenian model, but not if you're a Mexican blue-collar worker.
Yeah, it's totally different depending on your background. Not only Tiffany Trump, but also remember that senior White House advisor Steve Bannon is registered to vote in Florida and in New York, according to the Sarasota Herald Tribune. It's almost like this is an extremely common occurrence and not in any way, shape, or form evidence of massive voter fraud. Although, to be safe, maybe Trump should be locking up his daughter and Bannon until they get this whole thing figured out. But you know what this is about. This is about a crackdown. This is about doing an investigation that will find something totally milquetoast about dual registrations that aren't even against the law. I think I might be registered in 2 places right now. I think I'm still registered in Northampton, Massachusetts. If I were to show up there, I believe I'd be on the voter rolls, and I'm registered here in Boston. So again, Trump calling for an investigation into something that's not illegal, but it will be used. Mark my words. If there is anything turned up by this investigation, even just a few thousand people, many of whom could be college students like his own daughter, who were registered in 2 places, even if they've done nothing wrong, it will be used by the Trumpists and the Republicans to try to justify more voter ID, more voter suppression. It is absolutely clear what they are trying to do with this. We've got a great bonus show for you today, including soaring sales for George Orwell's book 1984 in the wake of alternative facts, and much more. DavidPakman.com/membership, coupon code IVoted17 if you want. We'll talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.